From opera-singing professional wrestlers to real toxic film sets that made crews sick, The Running Man 1987 hides some truly bizarre secrets behind its neon-soaked dystopian facade. This Arnold Schwarzenegger action flick featured everything from Family Feud's Richard Dawson playing against type to Paula Abdul choreographing dance sequences before her pop stardom, plus production disasters that would make any filmmaker cringe. Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about The Running Man 1987. Fact 1. Opera singer turned stalker. When audiences first meet Dynamo in The Running Man, they witness something truly unexpected. This hulking, electrically charged villain belting out a beautiful aria from Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro with the skill of a trained professional. What makes this scene even more remarkable is that the man behind the character, Erland van Lith, wasn't just acting the part of an opera singer, he actually was one, and that powerful voice audiences heard was completely authentic. Van Lith had an incredibly unique background that made him perfect for this bizarre role. Standing at 6 feet 5 inches tall and weighing over 300 pounds, he was a classically trained Helden baritone opera singer who had performed with major opera companies across the country. But his talents didn't stop at music. Was also an accomplished wrestler who had competed on the United States Olympic wrestling team and later became a professional wrestler and actor. This combination of classical musical training and physical prowess made him an ideal choice to play Dynamo, a character who needed to be both musically gifted and physically intimidating. The aria he performs in the film, Hai Gioventa la Causa, Vedrò mentre sospiro, is one of the most challenging pieces in the baritone repertoire, and Van Lith delivered it flawlessly while wearing his character's ridiculous light-up costume. His operatic performance provides one of the film's most surreal moments, creating a stark contrast between high culture and the movie's campy, violent game show setting. Tragically, Van Lith's appearance in The Running Man would be his final performance. He died of heart failure in May of 1987, just 2 months before the film's November release, at the young age of 34. His death meant that audiences were watching not just his last film role, but also one of his last musical performances. The Running Man stands as a fitting tribute to Van Lith's unique talents, capturing both his classical training and his larger-than-life screen presence in one unforgettable scene that perfectly encapsulates the film's blend of sophistication and absurdity. Fact 2. Director fired mid-production. The Running Man experienced one of Hollywood's most dramatic behind-the-scenes shakeups when the original director was abruptly fired just 1 week into filming, creating chaos that would affect the entire production and ultimately change the movie's tone completely. Andrew Davis, who would later go on to direct major hits like The Fugitive and Under Siege, was initially hired to helm the project, and had spent months in pre-production developing his vision for the Stephen King adaptation. However, after only 7 days of actual filming, the producers made the shocking decision to fire Davis because the production had fallen 1 week behind schedule. This kind of early dismissal is extremely rare in Hollywood, especially for a major studio picture, and it sent shockwaves through the cast and crew who had been working under Davis's direction. The timing was particularly awkward because Arnold Schwarzenegger had been out of town judging a bodybuilding contest during that weekend. And when he returned to Hollywood on Monday morning, he discovered that his director had been completely replaced without any warning. The producers quickly brought in Paul Michael Glaser as Davis's replacement, a choice that surprised many people in the industry. Glaser was best known for playing Detective Dave Starsky in the popular television series Starsky and Hutch, and while he had some directing experience with television episodes, taking over a big-budget action movie mid-production was a completely different challenge. Glaser had actually been approached to direct the film originally but had declined because he felt the pre-production period wasn't long enough for him to properly prepare. Arnold Schwarzenegger later expressed serious regret about this director change, calling it a terrible decision that fundamentally altered the movie's quality and vision. In interviews years later, Schwarzenegger explained that he believed Glaser shot the movie like it was a television show, losing all the deeper themes that had originally attracted him to the project. The star felt that this directorial switch transformed what could have been a more sophisticated satire into a simpler action movie, and he remained disappointed with how the change affected the final product throughout his career. Fact 3. Toxic steel mill location. The Running Man's most dangerous scenes weren't just dangerous for the characters on screen, they were actually hazardous to the real-life cast and crew who filmed them at one of the most contaminated industrial sites in California. The production team chose to shoot many of the game zone sequences at an abandoned steel mill that had been closed down specifically because of its extreme toxicity levels, creating a genuinely unsafe working environment that would be completely unacceptable by today's film industry standards. This particular steel mill had been shuttered after environmental authorities determined that the soil and structures were so heavily contaminated with industrial chemicals and heavy metals that any future development on the site would require excavating and removing contaminated earth to a depth of 60 feet below the surface. The level of contamination was so severe that simply building new structures on top of the existing foundation would pose serious health risks to anyone who worked or lived there. Yet the film's location managers somehow secured permission to bring a full Hollywood production crew to this toxic wasteland. For 8 grueling weeks, the cast and crew worked in this hazardous environment, breathing air filled with dangerous particles and handling equipment that had been exposed to decades of industrial pollution. The health consequences became apparent almost immediately, as numerous crew members began falling ill during the extended filming period at the location. Workers experienced a range of symptoms that suggested exposure to toxic substances, though the full extent of the health impacts may never be fully known since this was long before modern workplace safety protocols and environmental monitoring became standard practice on film sets. The irony of filming a dystopian science fiction movie about a dangerous, post-apocalyptic game zone in an actually dangerous, contaminated real-world location wasn't lost on some of the participants, though the serious health risks involved made it far from amusing for those who suffered the consequences. This location choice represents one of the most reckless decisions in film production history, where the desire to achieve authentic-looking industrial decay came at the expense of basic worker safety and environmental responsibility. Fact 4. Paula Abdul's prefame choreography. Years before Paula Abdul became a global pop sensation with hits like "Straight Up" and "Forever Your Girl," she was working behind the scenes as a choreographer on The Running Man, creating the elaborate dance sequences that would help define the film's over-the-top television show atmosphere. At the time of filming in 1987, Abdul was still building her reputation in the entertainment industry, having transitioned from her role as head choreographer for the Los Angeles Lakers cheerleading squad known as the Laker Girls to working on music videos and film projects. Abdul's work on The Running Man involved choreographing all the pre-show dance sequences that appeared during the fictional game show segments, creating energetic routines that perfectly captured the dystopian spectacle the filmmakers wanted to achieve. These dance numbers were designed to look like the kind of flashy entertainment that would precede a deadly reality show in a twisted future society, and Abdul's choreography brought exactly the right combination of professional polish and theatrical excess that the scenes required. The production team was so impressed with Abdul's contributions that they decided to honor her work in a very special way. Jackie Jackson, brother of Michael Jackson and member of the Jackson 5, composed the music that accompanied Abdul's choreographed dance sequences, and the entire musical piece was officially dubbed Paula's Theme, in recognition of her creative input and artistic vision for the scenes. This was actually Abdul's second film credit as a choreographer, though she had already established herself as a rising talent in the music video world by working on projects for major artists including Janet Jackson, ZZ Top, Duran Duran, and Debbie Gibson. Her experience with the Laker Girls had given her valuable skills in creating crowd-pleasing dance routines, and her work on music videos had taught her how to choreograph for cameras and create movement that would translate effectively to film. Just 1 year after The Running Man's release, Abdul would launch her own recording career and become one of the biggest pop stars of the late 1980s and early 1990s. Fact 5. Celebrity musicians as rebels. The Running Man features one of the most unusual casting decisions in 80s action cinema, with two major rock musicians playing members of the underground resistance in roles that created an inside joke only music fans would fully appreciate. Mick Fleetwood, the legendary drummer and founding member of the supergroup Fleetwood Mac, appears as the leader of the rebel organization fighting against the totalitarian government, and his character is simply named Mike, in what seems like an obvious reference to his real identity. The casting becomes even more clever when you discover that Fleetwood's right-hand man in the resistance is played by Dweezil Zappa, the son of avant-garde composer Frank Zappa, and his character is named Stevie. This name choice creates a clear tribute to Stevie Nicks, the iconic lead singer of Fleetwood Mac, who had been Mick Fleetwood's bandmate for over a decade by the time this movie was filmed. The filmmakers essentially created a musical reunion of sorts, pairing the real Mick with a fictional Stevie in their dystopian underground movement. In the film's backstory, Mick's character has a personal motivation for fighting the government that directly references Fleetwood's real-world career. During one of his scenes, Mick explains to Arnold Schwarzenegger's character that people like him locked up all my friends, burned my songs, and turned the country into a prison. This dialogue suggests that in the movie's timeline, the totalitarian regime specifically targeted musicians and artists, making Mick's rebellion not just political but deeply personal, since his livelihood and artistic community were destroyed by the oppressive system. Dweezil Zappa's inclusion adds another layer of musical authenticity to the resistance scenes, since his father Frank Zappa was famous for his anti-establishment views and experimental music that often challenged social norms. The name Dweezil itself has an interesting origin story, as it was originally a nickname that Frank Zappa created for one of his wife's toes, which later became his son's legal name when the young Dweezil insisted on making the unusual moniker official. This casting choice created a perfect pairing of rock royalty playing rebels against a system that had supposedly silenced their music. Fact 6. Richard Dawson's real personality. Richard Dawson's portrayal of the sleazy, manipulative game show host Damon Killian in The Running Man may have been more authentic than audiences realized, since people who worked with him behind the scenes on his real game show reported that his off-camera behavior was surprisingly similar to his villainous character. Dawson was already a household name when he took the role, having spent over a decade as the beloved host of Family Feud, where millions of viewers knew him as the charming, kiss-giving host who made contestants feel comfortable and welcome on television. However, according to numerous crew members and production staff who worked on Family Feud during Dawson's tenure from 1976 to 1985, the warm and friendly personality that audiences saw on screen was quite different from how he treated the people working behind the cameras. These industry insiders reported that Dawson could be demanding, condescending, and sometimes downright nasty when dealing with producers, directors, and other crew members who weren't in the public eye. This contrast between his public persona and private behavior made his casting in The Running Man particularly ironic, since he was essentially playing an exaggerated version of what some people claimed he was really like when the cameras weren't rolling. In the film, Damon Killian presents himself as a charming entertainer to his television audience, while treating his staff with contempt and cruelty, manipulating situations for his own benefit, and showing no genuine concern for the people whose lives he controls. The role seemed to come naturally to Dawson, who delivered one of the most memorable villain performances of the 80s without having to stretch very far from what crew members described as his actual personality. Film critic Roger Ebert praised Dawson's performance specifically, noting that he played the character as someone who always seems three-quarters drunk and could seamlessly switch between false jollity for the cameras and cold calculation behind the scenes. This dual nature that Ebert observed in the character was reportedly something that Family Feud staff members had witnessed firsthand during their years of working with the real Richard Dawson. Fact 7. Japanese game show inspiration. The concept for the Running Man's deadly game show didn't come from the filmmaker's imagination alone, but was actually inspired by a real Japanese television program from the 1980s called Trans-American Ultra Quiz that featured contestants enduring harsh treatment and psychological pressure for the chance to win prizes. This Japanese show represented an early example of what would later become known as reality television, though it took the concept to extremes that American audiences had never seen before on their television screens. Trans-American Ultra Quiz was structured as an elimination-style competition where multiple contestants started the show, but they were systematically removed through various challenges and ordeals until only one person remained to claim the grand prize. The show's format involved putting participants through physically and emotionally demanding situations that were designed to test their limits and break down their resolve, creating entertainment value from watching ordinary people struggle under extraordinary pressure. The Japanese program featured contestants being subjected to various forms of humiliation and discomfort as part of the competition process, though obviously nothing as extreme as the life-or-death scenarios depicted in the Running Man's fictional game show. However, the basic structure of watching people compete in increasingly difficult and degrading challenges while audiences cheered for their favorites provided the foundational concept that the movie's creators adapted for their dystopian setting. This inspiration from Japanese television reflects a broader cultural fascination during the 1980s with more extreme forms of entertainment that pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable on television. Japan had developed a reputation for producing game shows that were more physically demanding and psychologically intense than their American counterparts, featuring elaborate obstacle courses, embarrassing stunts, and contestants who were willing to endure significant discomfort for the chance to win money or prizes. The filmmakers took this real-world template of competitive elimination through suffering and extended it to its logical extreme, imagining what might happen if a society became so desensitized to violence and human suffering that watching people fight for their lives became the ultimate form of mass entertainment. Fact 8. Arnold's campaign bus tribute. When Arnold Schwarzenegger decided to run for governor of California in 2003, he made an unexpected tribute to one of his lesser-known films by naming his official campaign bus The Running Man, in honor of the 1987 science fiction movie. This choice was particularly surprising since The Running Man wasn't considered one of Schwarzenegger's most successful or critically acclaimed films, especially compared to his blockbuster hits like Terminator, Predator, or Total Recall, that had made him a global superstar. The decision to reference this specific movie during his gubernatorial campaign created an interesting connection between Schwarzenegger's entertainment career and his political ambitions. In The Running Man, his character Ben Richards was a man fighting against a corrupt government system that had framed him and turned him into a scapegoat for their own crimes, ultimately becoming a symbol of resistance against an oppressive regime. While the comparison between a deadly dystopian game show and a real political campaign might seem extreme, there were some thematic parallels that may have appealed to Schwarzenegger as he positioned himself as an outsider candidate challenging the established political system. The campaign bus naming also demonstrated Schwarzenegger's willingness to embrace his entire filmography, even the movies that hadn't been massive commercial successes or critical favorites. Rather than distancing himself from his action movie past as some actor-turned-politicians might do, Schwarzenegger seemed to celebrate the diverse range of characters he had played throughout his Hollywood career, including the wrongfully accused hero from The Running Man. This tribute also highlighted the enduring place that the film held in Schwarzenegger's personal memory, suggesting that despite his later criticism of how the production had been handled and his disappointment with the final result, he still felt enough connection to the project to reference it during one of the most important campaigns of his life. The campaign bus name served as a reminder that even his less celebrated films had contributed to building the public persona that would eventually help carry him to the California governor's mansion. Fact 9. Christopher Reeve almost starred. Before Arnold Schwarzenegger ever stepped into the role of Ben Richards, Christopher Reeve was originally attached to star in The Running Man, and his version would have told a completely different story that stayed much closer to Stephen King's original novel. Reev, who was best known for playing Superman in the late 70s and early 80s, represented a dramatically different type of leading man than the muscle-bound action hero that Schwarzenegger had become, and his casting would have fundamentally changed the entire tone and approach of the film. In the version that was planned around Reeve's involvement, the main character Ben Richards would have been an ordinary unemployed man struggling to survive in a devastated economy, rather than the wrongfully convicted police officer that Schwarzenegger eventually portrayed. This character would have voluntarily entered the deadly Running Man game show as a desperate last resort to earn money for his starving family, making his participation a tragic choice born out of economic necessity rather than government persecution. The story structure would have been completely different as well, with the game show lasting for 30 days, instead of the 3-hour Gladiator-style competition that appeared in the final film. This extended timeline would have allowed for a much more psychological and suspenseful approach, focusing on the mental strain of survival over an extended period, rather than the rapid-fire action sequences that became the movie's signature. The longer format would have been more faithful to King's vision of a society where people are slowly ground down by economic desperation until they're willing to risk their lives for entertainment. Reeve's physical appearance and acting style would have created a protagonist who audiences could relate to as an everyman hero, someone who looked like he could be their neighbor or co-worker rather than a superhuman action star. This casting choice would have emphasized the horror of ordinary people being forced into extraordinary circumstances by a cruel economic system, making the social commentary much more direct and personal than the spectacle-focused version that eventually reached theaters with Schwarzenegger in the lead role. Fact 10. Plagiarism lawsuit victory. The Running Man became the subject of a successful plagiarism lawsuit that revealed the film had been copied from an earlier French movie, creating a complex legal situation that involved multiple countries and decades of similar storylines. A court determined that the 1987 Arnold Schwarzenegger film was plagiarized from Le Prix du Danger, which translates to The Price of Danger, a French science fiction thriller that had been released in 1983, just 4 years before The Running Man hit American theaters. The French film Le Prix du Danger was directed by Yves Boisset and featured a remarkably similar premise about a deadly television game show where contestants risked their lives for money and entertainment, making the similarities between the two movies impossible to ignore when the case went to court. However, the plagiarism situation became even more complicated when it was discovered that the French film itself was not entirely original, since it had been based on a 1958 short story called The Prize of Peril, written by Robert Sheckley. This same Robert Sheckley story had actually inspired yet another adaptation years before either The Running Man or Le Prix du Danger were made, when German television producers created their own version called Das Millionenspiel, which translates to The Million Game, proving that the concept of deadly game shows for entertainment had been circulating in international cinema for quite some time. The German TV movie had been produced in 1970, making it the earliest screen adaptation of Sheckley's original story concept. The legal ruling against The Running Man highlighted how ideas can travel across borders and languages in the film industry, sometimes without proper acknowledgement or compensation to the original creators. The case also demonstrated how a single short story from the 1950s had managed to inspire multiple film and television adaptations across different countries over the span of nearly 30 years, with each version adding its own cultural perspective to the basic concept of survival entertainment. The successful lawsuit served as a reminder that even major Hollywood productions are not immune to accusations of borrowing too heavily from existing international works. Fact 11. Fake death scene cut. The Running Man originally contained one of the most audacious plot twists in action movie history, with screenwriter Stephen E. D'Souza designing a sequence that would trick audiences into believing that Arnold Schwarzenegger and Maria Conchita Alonso's characters had actually been killed with 20 minutes of runtime still remaining in the film. This bold narrative gamble was intended to shock viewers by appearing to eliminate the main heroes far earlier than anyone would expect, creating a moment of genuine surprise that would have been completely unprecedented in a major Hollywood action movie. The original version was carefully crafted to make the deaths look completely real to the audience, even though the characters within the movie's world were being fooled by computer-generated digital masks and body doubles. D'Souza wrote the sequence so that viewers would experience the same shock and disbelief as the fictional television audience watching the Running Man game show, not knowing that the apparent deaths were actually elaborate deceptions created by the villainous host, Damon Killian. When this version was shown to test audiences, the reaction was exactly what the filmmakers had hoped for in terms of emotional impact, but it created unexpected problems that the producers hadn't anticipated. The test screening attendees were genuinely stunned and confused by what they had just witnessed, with many people unable to believe that a major studio would actually kill off Arnold Schwarzenegger's character so early in the movie. The audience response was so intense that some viewers became angry or frustrated, feeling like they had been cheated out of the action-packed conclusion they were expecting. The producers became nervous about the strong negative reactions from the test screening, particularly when they realized that even though less than 2% of surveyed audience members said they didn't understand the plot twist, that small percentage was enough to make studio executives worry about confusing general audiences. Against the wishes of screenwriter D'Souza, who had fought hard to preserve his original vision, the decision was made to re-edit the sequence to reveal the fake deaths immediately, eliminating the surprise and ensuring that audiences would never be confused about whether the heroes had really died. Fact 12. Producer didn't know Stephen King. When producer Rob Cohen purchased the film rights to The Running Man in the early 1980s, he made what would later seem like an embarrassing oversight by completely failing to realize that the author listed on the book, Richard Bachman, was actually a pseudonym for one of the most famous writers in America. Cohen had been attracted to the novel's dystopian storyline and thought it would make an excellent science fiction thriller, but he apparently never bothered to investigate who Richard Bachman really was before committing to buy the adaptation rights. Stephen King had been using the Richard Bachman pseudonym since the 1970s as a way to publish books that were different from his usual horror novels, allowing him to explore other genres like science fiction and crime thrillers without the expectations that came with his established reputation. The Bachman identity also let King test whether his success was due to his writing talent or simply the power of his famous name, since books published under the pseudonym initially sold much fewer copies than his regular Stephen King novels. By the time Cohen bought the rights to The Running Man, the Richard Bachman secret had actually been exposed by a bookstore clerk in Washington, D.C., who noticed similarities in writing style and did some investigative work that revealed the connection. However, this revelation hadn't yet become widely known throughout the entertainment industry, and many people in Hollywood were still unaware that Bachman and King were the same person. The discovery that he had unknowingly acquired the rights to a Stephen King story must have been quite a pleasant surprise for Cohen, since King's name carried enormous commercial value that could significantly boost the film's marketing potential and box office appeal. Having a Stephen King adaptation gave the project much more credibility and marketability than a movie based on an obscure novel by an unknown author named Richard Bachman would have provided. This accidental acquisition of a Stephen King property turned out to be a stroke of luck that probably helped secure the larger budget and major star casting that eventually brought Arnold Schwarzenegger to the project. Fact 13. Chuck Woolery's lost role. The role of the villainous game show host Damon Killian in The Running Man was originally intended for Chuck Woolery, another well-known television game show personality, who had built his career hosting popular daytime programs throughout the 1970s and 80s. The producers specifically wanted Woolery for the part because he had the right combination of game show experience and physical presence that they felt would work well opposite Arnold Schwarzenegger, since Woolery was actually similar in height and build to the action star. Woolery had gained fame as the original host of Wheel of Fortune from 1975 to 1981 before moving on to host other successful game shows that had made him a familiar face to television and audiences across America. By 1987, when The Running Man was being cast, Woolery was simultaneously hosting two different game shows that were both performing well in the ratings and keeping him extremely busy with his television commitments. The scheduling conflict that prevented Woolery from taking the movie role came from his hosting duties on Love Connection, the popular dating game show where contestants would choose from 3 potential dates and then return to discuss how their evening went, and Scrabble, a word-based game show that was based on the famous board game. Both shows were successful programs that required Woolery's full attention and made it impossible for him to take time away for a film production that would require several weeks of shooting. When Woolery had to decline the role due to his television obligations, the producers needed to find another game show host who could bring the same kind of authentic television personality to the villainous character. Arnold Schwarzenegger himself suggested Richard Dawson as a replacement, since the two men had become close friends, and Schwarzenegger was a genuine fan of Dawson's work on Family Feud. This recommendation led to Dawson's casting in what would become one of his most memorable performances, though it's interesting to imagine how different the character might have been if Woolery had been available to take the role instead. Fact 14. Baseball helmet guards. One of the most creative examples of low-budget filmmaking ingenuity in The Running Man can be found in the costume design for the security guards at the ICS television studio, where the costume department decided to use ordinary baseball batting helmets as the foundation for creating futuristic-looking protective headgear. This choice represents the kind of practical problem-solving that production teams often employ when they need to create convincing science fiction costumes without spending enormous amounts of money on custom-made props, equipment. The ICS studio guards appear throughout the film as heavily armed security personnel who maintain order during the deadly game show tapings and protect the television facility from any potential threats or intrusions. These guards needed to look professional and intimidating, while also fitting into the movie's vision of what security forces might look like in a dystopian future society. But the production budget didn't allow for expensive custom helmet designs that would be used only for background characters. Baseball batting helmets turned out to be an ideal solution because they already had the right basic shape and protective appearance that the costume designers were looking for, and they could be easily modified with paint, additional attachments, and other decorative elements to make them look more futuristic and militaristic. The helmets provided a solid foundation that could be transformed into convincing science fiction gear without requiring the time and expense of building completely original pieces from scratch. This type of creative repurposing was common in 1980s science fiction films, where production teams frequently took everyday objects and modified them to create props and costumes that would fit their futuristic settings. The practice allowed filmmakers to achieve impressive visual effects and believable world building, even when working with limited budgets, and it often resulted in designs that were more practical and comfortable for actors to wear than elaborate custom-built alternatives would have been. The baseball helmet guards demonstrate how skilled costume and prop departments can take familiar objects and transform them into something that serves the story's needs while maintaining the illusion that audiences are watching events unfold in a completely different world from their own. Fact 15. American Gladiators inspiration. The Running Man's fictional game show concept became reality just 2 years after the movie's release when American Gladiators debuted on television in 1989, featuring the same basic premise of ordinary contestants competing against professional athletes in specialized physical challenges. The creators of American Gladiators openly acknowledged that The Running Man had served as a major inspiration for their show, though they obviously removed all the deadly violence and replaced it with safe, family-friendly competition that could actually be broadcast on network television. American Gladiators featured regular people from across the country who would travel to the show's arena-style set to face off against a team of muscular, costumed professional athletes who went by dramatic names like Laser, Nitro, Ice, and Gemini. These gladiators would compete against the contestants in events like Joust, where participants would try to knock each other off elevated platforms with padded sticks, and the Gauntlet, where contestants had to run through a series of obstacles while the gladiators tried to tackle them. The visual similarities between the two concepts were unmistakable. From the arena-style setting with cheering audiences to the larger-than-life personalities of the professional competitors who served as both obstacles and entertainment for viewers at home. The Running Man stalkers, with their themed costumes and signature weapons, clearly influenced the gladiators' colorful personas and specialized roles in different types of challenges, though the television version focused on athletic skill rather than combat prowess. American Gladiators became a massive hit that ran for 7 seasons and spawned international versions in multiple countries, proving that audiences were genuinely interested in watching regular people test themselves against professional athletes in televised competitions. The show's success demonstrated that the Running Man's central concept of competitive entertainment had real commercial appeal when adapted for mainstream television, even without the dystopian setting and life-or-death stakes that made the movie version so dark and satirical. The program's popularity helped establish the foundation for what would eventually become the modern reality television competition format that dominates programming today.